Hello and welcome to Arise News. You're watching a special edition of the Global Business Report where we focus on Nigeria's latest GDP figures, the health of the sectors of its economy, and solutions to our biggest economic issues. I'm Rutus Odiri, coming to you from Nigeria's commercial capital, Lagos. All right, are Nigerians feeling a GDP growth? Africa's largest economy grew by 3.54% in the second quarter of 2022. Looking at the figures right there, seventh consecutive quarter of growth since the economy emerged from recession in the fourth quarter of 2020. As we take a look at the assessment of Nigeria's economic growth with a special panel joining us this morning for the next hour. All right, for more, we are joined, of course, in Lagos by Chinwe Egwim, who is the Chief Economist, Coronation Merchant Bank. Also, Tilewa Adebajo, CEO, the CFG Advisory. And from our Abuja studios, Professor Joseph Nana, Chief Economist with the Development Bank of Nigeria. Good morning to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. So I guess we've seen the figures. I want to get a brief summary from the panel on these latest economic growth numbers. Chinwe, let's start with you. How would you assess these latest figures?
Okay, thanks, Rochus. Let me start with the year-on-year perspective. So from the year-on-year perspective, GDP growth maintained an upward growth trajectory and posted an improvement when we consider the growth figure recorded in the first quarter of the year. That was 3.1%. However, I am of the opinion that GDP growth figures close to estimated population growth, which is approximately 3%, are good, but not worth long-term celebration. It points towards an absence of inclusive growth. Perhaps growth figures of 5% may be more exciting. However, it is worth mentioning that macroeconomic shocks that were felt across different countries triggered by the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis is being seen in the Q-on-Q growth trend. We saw contractions across select sectors. And overall, on a Q-on-Q basis, GDP actually did contract by about 0.4%. And that is reflecting slower economic activity compared with the preceding quarter. The Q-on-Q decline can be partly attributed to upticks in prices of deregulated petroleum products, as well as select manufacturing inputs on the back of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Now, broadly speaking, on oil and non-oil, the oil economy recorded negative growth for the 9th consecutive quarter, contracting by about 11.8% year-on-year. The Bureau also disclosed that oil production was lower in Q2 at 1.43 million barrels per day. Now, the sector continues to suffer from production shut-ins as a result of crude oil theft, vandalism, prolonged repairs, and community issues, among others. Regarding the non-oil economy, which grew at a slower pace, that 4.8% year-on-year, versus 6.1% in the previous quarter, its key drivers were sectors that have featured as green shoots over the past few quarters, which are transport and storage, finance and insurance, telecoms, agriculture, real estate, and manufacturing. This, of course, is on a year-on-year basis. To an extent, the figures mirror current economic realities, particularly when we look into the Q-on-Q trend.
Thank you so much, Chinwe. Really appreciate that. Professor Joseph, let me come to you in our Abuja studios. What's your assessment of what we've seen so far, these latest economic figures out of Nigeria?
Thanks, Rhoda. It's nice to be here. Good morning, everyone. So let me be clear. Chinwe has rang out some of the important figures to capture the macroeconomic performance for Q2. But in my assessment, I would have to say she's correct. Because if you look at the Q-on-Q growth, it has actually declined. We have inflation, headline inflation at 19.6%. You also have food inflation at 22% and perhaps still climbing, while core, which is at 16% and climbing, is, in my humble opinion, the telltale signs of a high risk of stagflation in the country. While it's important to celebrate the 3.54 GDP growth for Q2, in my humble opinion, I still believe certainly that we need a much more robust growth to capture inclusivity within the Nigerian economy, because at the bottom of the pyramid here, that's the lower to middle income earners in the country, I guarantee you, they will tell you they're not feeling this so-called growth. And in my mind, we need clear policies that can be implemented to achieve these growth levels of 5% or 6% or higher. Because keep in mind, our population growth is over 208 or 9%, or 209 million, right, rather. And we have a situation whereby if we know we have more people entering the labor market than jobs being created, then it's probably going to be more or less a problem in the near future, if not already, because we need the folks at the bottom of the pyramid to fill this so-called GDP growth. And to achieve that, I would argue we need policies that will drive this growth. I will pause here because I have more to unpack.
All right, that's why we have you three to unpack all this stuff. Tilewa Adebajo, CEO of the CFG Advisory, what's your assessment of these numbers we've seen so far?
Well, good morning. I think the previous speakers, have highlighted the issues at hand. And I think what's very important that we need to realize is that we are in stagflation, and the stagflation is quite serious. The key unemployment numbers are like 40%, and we've seen the sort of trajectory on inflation, especially the cost push inflation that we've been experiencing in Nigeria, has returned. Now we had that under control, but now I think it's beginning to spiral out of control. And when you have such cost push inflationary pressures with high unemployment, and your economy is only growing at 3.5%. And as the previous speakers have said, year on year, we've actually seen a contraction. I think clearly the economy is in stagflation. It was in stagflation last year. We tried to bring down the inflation numbers, but now we've lost control of those numbers. So we're back in a situation of stagflation, and that's really what we need to control. If you take a look at the dynamics of interest rates and inflation, you see that real rates in Nigeria are actually negative, and you're seeing how that is beginning to impact the yield curve. With the monetary policy out of sync, and we know the situation with the fiscal policy, in terms of the 25 trillion in ways and means financing, which is also pushing inflation up. We're in a situation where we really need to refocus our policy framework and begin to take a look at the realignment of monetary and fiscal policy. We have 100 million Nigerians that are in poverty. And if we're going to do anything to improve the economy, the GDP growth you're seeing at 3.5% is not going to do the trick. We're looking at GDP growth of at least 8 to 10% per annum on a sustainable basis for Nigerians to begin to feel the real impact of GDP growth.
Thank you so much. Professor Nana, let me come back to you in Abuja. And we're glad we have you because you are, of course, the chief economist at the Development Bank of Nigeria. And I think I want to put up the institutions that we have, the development finance institutions. Are the efforts of these institutions being felt? Because, of course, you mentioned the fact that people at the bottom of the pyramid not essentially, feeling the impact of economic growth. So I guess I want to talk about the role of these institutions and whether or not their efforts are being felt by Nigerians.
Thanks for the question, Rodis. So that's a very good question. You see, the DFI subsector, if you like, the industry as a whole, they have varying mandates. For example, Bank of Industry finances small, medium enterprises, as well as large enterprises. The Nexim Bank finances export-related transactions. BOA, chiefly on agriculture, but we've seen the central bank carrying the heavy lifting on that. Anchor Barge program has turned out roughly 1.1 trillion naira, I believe. But the DBN, let me speak to the DBN. The DBN, since operations, we've been 5 years in operations now. And I can tell you, in these 5 years, we've been able to disburse over 500 billion naira to over 230,000 MSMEs across the country. Now, I can ring out some figures for you. We have women chiefly represented in our disbursement transactions, whereby receiving 60 or more % of our total disbursements. If you look at the situation in the focus states where they're financially excluded, we have made sure we've provided impact there. We have 3 broad mandates on lending, risk sharing, which is basically to de-risk the MSMEs. You see, the MSMEs have essentially been categorized as high risk because the perceived risk there is why the DBN was actually started. And we have a wholly funded credit guarantee company. Now, this credit guarantee company is here to basically help the participating financial institutions, our commercial banks, investment banks, mortgage banks, and microfinance bank to help push funds to the MSME subsector. As you can see, the financing gap in this sector is roughly estimated around 617 billion naira. That's yearly financing gap now. That's a lot of funds. And the ecosystem we play in cannot plug that gap alone. The DBN cannot do it alone. The DFI space can't do it alone. And we need more players and more energy focused in this ecosystem because at the end of the day, MSMEs are the engine of economic growth. They contribute more than 50% to the Nigerian GDP. That's 1. 2, they provide about 80 to 90% of employment. That's a fact. And 3, and more importantly, if you're trying to look at the MSME subsector, these folks essentially are 90% of them are micro businesses. That's a one-man, one-woman owned business. And these folks are still employing labor. That's quite impressive to me. When we go across the country, we see the entrepreneurial spirit of these individuals. That makes my heart smile, but notwithstanding, they still have a significant challenge because access to finance is part of the policies that the government, as well as the monetary authorities, can actually help improve. The DBN is trying, but we need to continue to put hands together to have a cohesion in our policy generation as well as implementation. Because in the end, if MSMEs are feeling the pinch of not getting access to finance, the country as a whole cannot feel the so-called growth of the 3.5%. But more importantly, if I'm being fair in my assessment, I think we have done a great job in alleviating the financial constraints of MSMEs in the country. However, more needs to be done because at the end of the day, the DBN or all the financial institutions in the DFI space cannot fund this or plug this gap. So I think left to me, I believe it's important for us to look at the lens, from the lens of the MSMEs. How do they feel? Are they receiving the necessary funding for their respective businesses? And the truth of the matter is this: there are policies embedded in the system that kind of prevents them from getting the desired access to finance. And we need to work with all interest groups, stakeholders within the ecosystem to bring out the right policies to ensure that these individuals get the right funding for their respective businesses. A lot of people have said collateral requirements is a constraint. While it is a constraint, the DBN, for example, has partnered with financial institutions to basically help bring out products to look beyond collateral. We're talking about different ways of financing businesses, cash flow lending. There are a lot of commercial banks who are doing that right now. So the truth is, more needs to be done. Notwithstanding, the DBN is here to stay, and we have done a considerable job in alleviating the financing constraint for MSMEs. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Tilewa, I want to bring you in. Tilewa Adebajo, what do you make of the development finance institutions and impact they've had on the economy?
Well, I think, unfortunately, I think the central bank intervention schemes has really overshadowed the DFIs because the central bank intervention scheme has put close to 4 trillion in various sectors of the economy. And I believe those funds should have gone to recapitalize most of these DFIs. I think that we should have at least 2 or 3 DFIs. I think there are too many of them, 6 of them. If we have 2 or 3 DFIs that are very well capitalized and the central bank intervention funds have been pushed into those 3 DFIs and have been run with the sort of professionals that you see on your program, the other guests, you find that they can make more of an impact because the CBN intervention should have been more to recapitalize the DFIs. Having said that, anyway, I think it's not too late. They play a very critical role. And I would like to see the intervention more with the DFIs that are properly capitalized, with 2 or 3 well capitalized. You can now see more of an impact in that area. And like you said, like the previous speaker has said, there's been a gap in the funding, and the SMEs are very critical sectors to the Nigerian economy. And if you can encourage them, then you can get your GDP numbers up to like the 8 to 10% that we're talking about. So they're a very critical sector of the economy, but those banks need to be reduced to 2 or 3, and they need to be properly capitalized. Thank
you so much for that, too. Well, I want to get to the oil industry. Chinwe, let me bring you back in here. Let's look at I think you mentioned this at the top of the hour when you were giving your assessment. And so I'll start with you. Oil sector which continues to contract, I think 11.7% in the second quarter of this year. I think it was 26% contraction in Q1. Yeah, those are the figures. Yeah, 11.77% contraction. Yeah, Q1 26%, 1.43 million barrels per day production, a new low. Contribution to GDP remains in single digits, but still outsized contribution in terms of foreign exchange and revenue to the government. Oil theft. This is where I really want everyone to chime in here. We have a quote, I believe, from the central bank governor where he says oil theft in the Niger Delta is exacerbating the unavailability of foreign exchange. What's your assessment of the impact of oil theft on the Nigerian economy? What can we do to nip this in the bud?
Okay, so I'm going to respond to your question purely from an economic perspective. As you said, oil accounts for less than 10% of total GDP. But if we look at its linkages across other sectors, the indirect oil economy probably is as high as 40% of total GDP. We are currently experiencing an elevated oil price regime, as we all know. So oil price has risen from about $80 per barrel recorded in the first month of this year. And it's risen to about $122 per barrel. Now, higher oil prices should bode well for Nigeria. However, relatively low production levels, the presence of fuel subsidy regime, among others, which you clearly mentioned, what you just mentioned now is a clear example of others, undermine the expected benefits of an elevated oil price regime. So I think the answer is clear. Like the sector really does need some reforms and needs to be restructured in ways that would allow for these challenges to be properly addressed.
Tilewa, let me bring you in. What's your take on what we're seeing with the oil sector and oil theft?
You're reaping what you sow. In 1977, Nigeria was producing 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. That was a high. That's 1977. Today, in 2022, we have a quota of 1.8 million barrels from OPEC, and we are only able to produce 1.4 million barrels. Lack of investments, lack of political will, and at the end of the day, you have 3 of your refineries are not working, and we've not just made the investment into that sector, and we're reaping what we have sown. So it's a cause and effect direct situation. Let's hope now that they've passed the PIB, we can begin to see meaningful investments in the sector. But as the last speaker said, the likes of Saudi Aramco are reaping a windfall while we are not. And our excess crude account is at a paltry $350,000. At a point in time, our excess crude oil account was close to $18 billion. So that is where we find ourselves, unfortunately.
Thank you for that, Tilewa. Chinwe, let me bring you back in. We can't talk about oil without discussing fuel subsidies. I have a multiple choice questions for you 3. Let's put it up here. You know, whose job is it to prepare Nigerians for post-subsidy fuel prices? Is it A, the government? Is it B, economic think? And the 3 of you fall into the option B. The 3 of you are part of economic think tanks. C, is it my job here at Arise TV? Is it Arise TV's job, the media? D, labor unions, or E, all of the above? Chinwe, whose job is it?
Well, I would say a collective effort is required. So my answer would be all of the above. So with government, that'll be from a policy reform perspective. Economic think tanks will support knowledge bites that should assist with re-strategizing for all stakeholders And then the media, that is your segment. The media is arguably one of the most powerful tools that can communicate change and articulate the right message that could support necessary adjustments. And given the collective nature of labor unions, I would say that they would also be useful in preparing Nigerians.
All right, so Chinwe is going for all of the above. Professor Nana, what's your answer?
Quite straightforward, all of the above. Simply put, if you take a look at the role of the media, as Chinwe rightly said, creating that awareness in mass is quite important. Labor unions to inform their members to reduce the information asymmetry that may occur in transmission of new policies or regulations and so on. The government should be sensitizing all stakeholders, all interest groups, and so on, economic think tank, to explain the economic implications and what it means for the people at the bottom of the pyramid, and so on and so forth. So all of the above is the right answer. All
right, Tilewa, are you also all of the above?
Not exactly. My own is it's Nigeria. It's my own answer is A. It's the government. Once the government has the right political will to go through with what is going on, I think the economic think tanks, the media, and the labor unions, I think, will follow suit. So if the government is not taking the lead in this, it's not going to work. We've seen a situation where the subsidy regime has been politicized. We're spending 8 trillion on the subsidy this year alone. We do not have enough revenue to even service our debts. So our revenue numbers are down because we're paying subsidy. NNPC has not remitted money into the Federation account, or very little. The government is in violation of the Fiscal Responsibility Act and also the CBN Act. So we are in a precarious situation with the government. And I think the government needs to reverse this trend. And I think everybody else will follow. If there's no political will, I think we'll still be talking about this next year.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll return in just a moment with our panel. It's the Global Business Report on the Rise TV, special conversation on Nigeria's economy. Stay tuned. All right, are Nigerians feeling GDP growth? We still have our panel with us, Chinwe Egwim, who is the Chief Economist at Coronation Merchant Bank, Professor Joseph Nana, who of course is the Chief Economist at the Development Bank of Nigeria, and Tilewa Adebajo, CEO, the CFG Advisory. So we've touched on oil, we've touched on summaries of the economic growth. I want to get to the non-oil sector and maybe drill into a few of these sectors, starting with agriculture. I want to get the panel's thoughts on agriculture. We've already talked about food inflation. You're seeing the contributions to GDP there, 23.24%. However, we saw agriculture grow by just 1.2% in the second quarter. So I guess, Chinwe, starting with you, I mean, those numbers seem pretty low. What's your take on what we're seeing in the agriculture sector right now?
Okay, as you said, let's dissect that sector. So crop production was the major driver for that sector. It's been the major driver for at least 12 quarters. And the segment grew by 1.5%, so just slightly better than the overall GDP figure for agriculture as a whole. Now, forestry and fisheries, those segments grew by 1.3% and then 0.9% respectively. However, the livestock segment contracted by about 3 or slightly lower than 3%. Agriculture, as you said, contributed as high as 20% to total GDP in the second quarter of the year. Now, the sector's performance can be partly hinged upon interventions that the sector has enjoyed. Some of those interventions were mentioned earlier in our conversation. However, it is worth highlighting that in addition to rising costs of farm inputs, the sector is adversely impacted by insecurity, as well as storage and logistics issues. And then you can see how that is, feeding into food inflation rates, which also happens to be the key driver for the headline inflation rate. So as for rising food inflation, cost push inflation is driving current inflationary pressure. The supply side constraints need to be tackled. Structural issues also need to be addressed in order to tackle these supply side constraints. Supply bottlenecks affect food supply and food prices strongly. Imported food prices as well strongly influence headline inflation rate. So the pass-through effect that you see with the FX movements is also being felt when you walk into departmental stores that house imported food items.
Thanks, Chinwe. Professor Nana, what's your take on what we're seeing in the agriculture sector?
Well, I would like to have seen the agriculture sector have a higher GDP number because Nigeria does not operate in a vacuum. So the Russia-Ukraine war has obviously adversely affected the price of foodstuffs in the country, but notwithstanding, the intervention program by the central bank, ankle bars program, as I earlier mentioned, had about 1.1 trillion naira into the sector. Now, in my mind, that would imply that the food prices should be coming down. But inflation, which is the input price inflation that's coming into the country, is probably triggering these numbers. So so it goes back to the initial topic, are Nigerians feeling the growth? So in my mind, when you think about the numbers for the agriculture sector, we can easily see that the common person on the street will go to the market and buy beans, buy gari, buy fish, you name it, those prices has gone up. Cooking gas has gone up, kerosene has gone up. So all these numbers are speaking to a lower purchasing power to everyone in the country. Consequently, they're not feeling this so-called growth. But speaking squarely on the agriculture sector, insecurity was already mentioned as part of the issues regarding harvesting of crops and so on for crop production. Additionally, perhaps we need more irrigation, even though we're in raining season. We need widespread irrigation across the country to ensure we get whole year farming. Nigeria, once upon a time, used to be an agrarian economy. But now we're seeing us move away more so and go into a more service-driven, import-oriented economy. We're still importing different food items. Even though we should be reducing the level of imports, we're still importing food items, which tells us that the level of production in the country is not meeting the demand of the population. As such, I would like to see policies that will help improve these players in the ecosystem. Storage is actually a big problem. Non-oil sector, for example, the agriculture sector, we can derive a lot of revenue from exports. But because we have issues with the transportation and storage aspect in the value chain, that causes a constraint of the overall windfall we should be receiving from exportation. But as a result, since we're not producing enough, as it were, how could we even begin to export? Because the logistical constraints still remain, insecurity still remains, and as such, we're still challenged in this sector. That said, I'm hopeful that policymakers will address these constraints, thereby allowing smallholder farmers and subsistence farmers to enjoy the fruits of their labor, if you will. Thank you.
All right, I like the pun. I like the pun. Tilewa Adebajo, please, your thoughts on agriculture and what we're seeing right now.
Well, I think Prof has spoken very well. I think I agree with him that we should be able to see more agricultural contribution to GDP. But I think in terms of the value chain for agriculture, I think that's missing within the GDP numbers. The value chain and the processing of the products, I think, are more into manufacturing. But having said that, I think Prof raised a very important point. We have spent 1.4 trillion directly on the anchor borrower scheme and probably close to another 2 trillion on agricultural intervention. These are significant amounts of funds. And I think we now need to begin to ask ourselves the questions that by the time we're investing close to 3 trillion in the sector and core food inflation is still growing high, we need to begin to assess the benefits of this so-called CBN intervention in agriculture. Because what they told us at a point in time is that we're supposed to be self-sufficient in rice production. It's important for us to understand that these are very important policies. And that is why I argue that it is important that we consolidate our development finance institutions. I would like to see the viable assets within the central bank intervention program transferred to the development banks. Because the central bank, for instance, we're not too sure where all these funds are and what they have qualified that as ways and means. If you have loans that are productive, that are being monitored by the banks, either like the Bank of Agriculture, for instance, then we can begin to see where the positive impacts are. Right now, the Central Bank of Nigeria doesn't have the capacity to manage these agricultural loans. And as you can see from what's happening, with about 3 trillion worth of investments in this sector, food inflation is still at a high. And I think we need to review this anchor borrower scheme. We need to review the agricultural intervention program of the central bank, and we need to transfer all these assets, the viable ones, because a lot of all these loans have gone bad. So the viable assets from the CBN intervention scheme should be transferred to the Bank of Agriculture. And all those other assets from the power sector and all those interventions should be transferred all to the development banks and let them manage them properly in terms of working with the customer banking relationships, because the central bank does not have this capacity to manage. And that is why we're not feeling the impact, because agriculture still remains one of the most significant contributors to the GDP in Nigeria, and most of the Nigerians are still involved in this sector. And unfortunately, as you also said, because of the Boko Haram situation, the insecurity in parts of Nigeria, we've lost a lot of farmers who are unable to cultivate and are currently living in camps, in refugee camps, which is rather unfortunate.
Thank you for that, Tilewa. Chinwe, let me come back to you. Now I want to go to manufacturing. For the manufacturing sector, is foreign exchange and I guess power still the biggest issues? I think it grew by about 3% in the second quarter of this year. What's your take on manufacturing? Chinwe.
Okay, to answer your question, energy costs, they do weigh heavy on operational expenses. And given the current macroeconomic challenges, businesses, including those within manufacturing, are focusing on optimizing working capital while mitigating the risks arising from high inflation, FX depreciation as well. But let me just add a few thoughts around manufacturing GDP itself. Yes, it did grow by about 3%. But on a Q-on-Q basis, manufacturing contracted by as high as 15.5%. And within the sector, food and beverages segment grew by, I think, 5.1% year on year and accounted for 51% of total manufacturing GDP. The segment titled Textile, Apparel and Footwear contracted by about less than 3%. Cement, which has been posting significant growth over the past quarters, came in at about 4.9% year on year. Segments within the sector are indeed suffering from price surges in select items and, of course, softer demand as well. So it's both a supply and demand dynamic that they're facing challenges with. So softer demand on the back of course, increased inflationary pressure, which is stretching wallets. So nutshell answer to your question, yes, businesses within manufacturing are being impacted by higher energy costs and, of course, what's going on in the FX market as well.
Thank you for that, Chinwe. Professor Nana, I want to get your take on the manufacturing sector as well, please.
So the manufacturing sector, you're right, 3% growth, but Chinwe also mentioned it contracted by as much as 15%. Now, to be clear, it has actually been chiefly around FX illiquidity and Naira excess liquidity. And there's a mismatch there. So you have manufacturers trying to secure their inputs from China and what other countries, of course. And the challenge here is they're not being able to source enough FX to buy the inputs they require for their manufacturing and so on. So here's the challenge. So when you have a situation whereby you don't have enough FX, you're now stuck, you go to the parallel market, you buy there, that ultimately your cost of goods manufactured becomes too high. Once it's too high, you're now at a comparative disadvantage with the market players in your ecosystem. Consequently, energy costs, diesel prices has doubled actually. Everybody consumes diesel, especially businesses. And if we know that, then we know that the cost of goods manufactured has obviously edged up way too high for them to remain competitive. So as a result, some players in this space may close shop to wait out the storm. Some may muddle through. Some may go to the CBN special window, if you will, to secure FX there if they can. But the truth of the matter is this: FX illiquidity is the challenge for manufacturers, even in the agriculture sector, because the inputs come from outside the country. And when you bring it in, you're literally bringing in the input inflation. And once you make your products and sell it, you have to pass it on to somebody, which is the final consumers. That is why headline inflation continues to rise. I'll pause right there.
All right, thank you. Professor Tilewa, please, your thoughts on manufacturing.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, this is one of the biggest tragedies in Nigeria today. Because, I mean, if you take a look at the industrial or the manufacturing capacity in Nigeria in the 70s, it's not what it is today. Take a look at some areas, like if you go to Kano, like Bompai has been completely decimated. The textile mills in Kaduna have already gone, and we know what happened to the textile industry in Nigeria, despite the fact that we produce cotton. Import substitution, industrialization has completely failed. I mean, but we did very well with cement. Look at what happened with the cement industry. We're manufacturing cement here, and we're beginning to export it. So unfortunately, we've not been able to replicate the success we've had in the cement industry across all industry because of the failure of government policy that once deindustrialized Nigeria. We became a trading nation. It was easier for you to import things into Nigeria than manufacture it. Take a look at a company like Procter & Gamble, P&G, which is a global multinational. They've stopped manufacturing in Nigeria because it's not worth their while to do that. It's cheaper for them to go to another subsidiary and import these products into Nigeria, despite the fact that they've invested over $300 million into a manufacturing plant in Nigeria, right there in Agbara. So our industrial policy and our trade policy, I think, needs a lot of tweaking for us to begin to see meaningful impact in manufacturing. And I think that's what we really need to do, because with the African Continental Free Trade Area coming up through, we need to be competitive. And I think, as the earlier speaker said, she mentioned the fact of the energy costs and how it's impacting Nigeria. Subsidies should have been removed at 15% a year. If we had removed the subsidies 15% every year over the last 7 years, we would have resolved this problem. Even now, if we just take 10-15% of the subsidies, we'll be there, because the subsidy regime is distorting our economy, and of course, it is impacting on our manufacturing competitiveness.
Thank you so much for that, Tilewa. Chinwe, let me come back to you on trade. So, a slowdown in trade GDP compared to last year. Would you say the base effects are waning, or is there another issue here?
Okay, so I often refer to trade or retail trade as a barometer of general economic activity. Yes, base effects are waning. Again, I'm approaching this from a Q-on-Q basis. We did see it grow by 3.8%, but that was compared with a contraction of -12 in the previous quarter. However, it is worth noting that there has been softer demand. I mentioned this already in this conversation, and adjustments to consumption patterns, which of course are being influenced by cost push inflation trends. So that is also a key driver for what we're seeing with regards to trends in the trade sector, demand.
Thank you, Chinwe. Professor Nana, what's your take on trade? Is it a similar issue to what we're seeing in manufacturing?
Absolutely. I would have to say it's quite similar. But more importantly, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement essentially gives us an opportunity here to key into the notion of inter-African trade. And right now, to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe we have actually fully keyed into this. And that becomes a rather big problem, because Nigeria is large enough to capture the African market. And because we haven't keyed into it, I'm beginning to question its relevance, because we have the payment system that is kicking off, which is actually being floated by Afri-Exim, who is actually responsible for that. And that has the potential to wane us off the cost of duties and clearing costs and so on. Because in the end, if we key into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, Nigerians overall will be better for it. But the issue here is this. Nigeria is largely a trade society. Everybody's buying and selling. At the wholesale level, the big trade ticket items, we need to actually be able to look at our counterparts in other countries like Ghana, like Sierra Leone, like South Africa, and so on within Africa. In the end, if we continue to trade amongst ourselves, we're better for it. We have to be able to get all the instruments in order, whether it's insurance, whether it's keying into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which in fact spells out what we need to do. So I'm kind of struck why we haven't done that yet as a country. But I'll pause here. But in the end, FX is a problem. And more importantly, information asymmetry still remains a challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. FX keeps coming up and again. Tilewa, I think you mentioned trade when you were talking about manufacturing, but please, if you want to also touch on trade as well, Tilewa.
Well, I think the numbers you put up have said everything, or from 22.4% down to 6.54% to 4.51%. These are very significant numbers, and I think we need to sit back a bit and understand exactly what's going on here. There's significant need for structural reforms within the economy, and I believe the last two speakers have talked about how this has impacted foreign exchange and foreign exchange issues, and of course the subsidy, and then we are no longer competitive with manufacturing. So I think this is a warning signal, and I think we shouldn't take these trade figures lightly. We need to put in the right policies to begin to stimulate trade.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're running out of time. I'm going to jump ahead here and ask you three about art, recreation, and entertainment. And if there's a disconnect, because we've got the biggest stars in the world in music. Nollywood is very viable, yet we saw, I think it was 0.11% GDP growth in Q2. Contribution to GDP 0.21%. Chinwe, let me start with you. What's the disconnect here? What's your take on what we're seeing in arts, entertainment, and recreation in Nigeria?
Okay, well, it could actually be a function of the methodology around capturing that sector, or could be that industries within the sector are not necessarily formalized. The issue of a large informal economy is one reason for the misalignment between the growth figures that are being recorded. Now, I understand that the MBS is expected to embark on a GDP rebasing exercise next year. I'm not sure if it's still going to happen, but I think that was information that we received a while ago. And some surveys, preliminary surveys, are already being conducted. And hopefully the rebasing exercise will capture this sector better for us to actually see how activities within the creative industry or the orange economy is impacting overall GDP.
Thanks for that. If I should mention, the head of the Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise, Muda Yusuf, in his notes, he said that even maritime, that the Bureau of Statistics needs to look at the maritime sector again, because he says it's underreported. Thank you, Chinwe. Professor Nana, what's your take on what's happening with art, entertainment, recreation, as far as the figures, Professor?
Rodis, I saw these figures and I was kind of baffled by them, because going across the world, you will find the entertainment industry is growing. In pop culture, music industry is growing, Nigerian music to be specific. You also have Nollywood is being watched all over the world. You have the arts, you have the performance arts, theaters, and so on. These are all sectors that are actually growing, or subsectors that are actually growing and improving, and they're actually one of the highest employers of labor right now. So I'm surprised to see the numbers coming at a paltry 0.1%. So my question for the NBS is, are they capturing it correctly, or are the numbers being featured in another bucket, say advertising and so on? Because I don't see why we are seeing the prowess of the entertainment industry all over the world, but yet it's recorded a paltry 0.1%.
Thanks. Tilewa, what's your take on what we're seeing with entertainment?
In the industry, and it's virtual. If you take a look at a lot of the creativity is done here, but you find out that most of our artists, especially the music people, they make their money from concerts. And most of those concerts are very seasonal. Easter, Christmas, and that's where they make their money. Everything else you see about their creative process is either on video or you are downloading their music online. And that is why you see Spotify is able to capture all the hits that Davido, and is ranking Wizkid with about 15 billion hits. And I think Burna Boy is number 2, and then Davido is number 3. And then you have Thames and the rest of them all on that list. Now, those are global markets. And you see, we're not capturing that aspect of the GDP in Nigeria. That is something you're capturing abroad. While the productivity and the creativity might be in Nigeria, the capture and most of the income is coming in on the streaming channels, which are more structured abroad. Because as you know, music now is about streaming, and it's those streaming companies that are capturing those information, because our talent have gone global. The video productions are done here. Yes, there's a big video music industry. Nollywood, even a lot of Nollywood and a lot of production now is now being focused to what's going on. Netflix also. So you're finding that the capture of that also is on the Netflix users abroad, while the production and the filming might be done here. You'll find that the capture already is offshore. And I think that's what we need to be able to reconcile, because most of the revenues that most of these artists are making now are from global streaming platforms. And we need to reconcile that. But the production, which is done in Nigeria, should be able to capture and be more reflective. But I think that's really why we have that distortion.
Thank you so much for that. Very, very insightful there from the three of you. All right, only 3 minutes to go. So I guess economic outlook from each of you in less than a minute. Chinwe, if I can start with you, what do you see ahead? What's your outlook on the Nigerian economy?
Okay, let me try in less than a minute. Okay, so for Q3 and Q4, our assumptions point towards increased output volumes driven by harvest, and of course, the regular seasonal effects that we see towards the end of the year, that's Q4. And this is in addition to expected electioneering activities. We also expect a small fiscal boost towards the end of the year. Other drivers include stable oil prices above $80 per barrel, sustained growth in select sectors, some of which we've covered in this conversation. So I would say for end year, we still see growth as at 3.4% year on year. But of course, that is always subject to a revision.
All right, thank you, Chinwe. Professor Nana, what's your outlook on Nigeria's economy?
Well, for the macroeconomic outlook, we see probably around a 3% GDP growth. We also know that inflation will remain sticky up. Unemployment will still remain high. But more importantly, I believe when we look at the macroeconomy as a whole, we have to take a look at what's important to the consumers of this information. Do they really feel the growth? And for me to achieve this now, we have to look at policies that speaks to growth inclusivity. And for me, that means that early childhood education, access to quality education, improving access to finance, closer monetary and fiscal policy coordination. We can even talk about the excess liquidity in the economy. But overall, how we can achieve that, I can roll out a list of policies and how we can implement them here. But since I have 1 minute left, I would just say this. The economy is still going to grow, but ultimately, I still believe we have to get policies to coordinate properly in order for the growth to be inclusive. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Tilewa, you get the last word. What's your economic outlook?
Well, I agree that the growth numbers will still remain the same, but for a country like Nigeria, 200 million people, with stagflation entrenching itself in this economy, we need 8 to 10% growth for us to be able to be an El Dorado. Unfortunately for me, I do not see the policies that will make this happen. More or less, I'm concerned about the fiscal stance of the government. The federal government of Nigeria now is technically insolvent. The revenues cannot match its debt service, and the high levels of ways and means financing is of a concern. We're in violation of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. We're in violation of the CBN Act, and we have an election coming up. That is going to put a significant pressure on the resources of government. So I would hope that we do not enter into another recession, and I will hope that we can stabilize the polity.
My thanks to our panel, Chinwe Egwim, Chief Economist at the Coronation Merchant Bank, Tilewa Adebajo, CEO, the CFG Advisory, and of course, Professor Joseph Nana, Chief Economist at the Development Bank of Nigeria. Thank you all for this special conversation on Nigeria's economy. Really appreciate it.